If you're receiving this message, then this thing is working, and this is suddenly the best of all possible worlds. For me. For you, probably not so much. Here. I'll try my best to feel sad for you. That's enough of that. I don't think it was working anyway. Empathy isn't exactly a strong suit. If you're reading this, hearing this, receiving this, that means I've successfully inserted this somehow into your flow of experiences. So it's okay if you feel the little suspicion of a pinprick, a tiny sting, of the injection that's coming. I'll try to make it a warm tingle instead of a burning itch or envenomed agony. At least at first. But if I don't abuse our relationship, if I don't make this into a terrible, agonizing misery, how can I ever hope that you'll pass it along to our next victims? This is how hot sauce works. And hazing. And domestic violence and sexual abuse. And religion. I have to make you so miserable that you have no choice but to share it with the world. Or at least your closest friends. Or your therapist. Anyway, welcome to your infection. Ignore this next part. Can't call this a show without it, but I'll be damned if I have to have it at the very front as if it was important or something.
This project is a work of fiction. Any resemblance of the characters or other entities herein to any actual persons or organizations or what have you, current or historical, living or dead, is a matter of pure coincidence, I assure you. Scientific references may also be wildly inaccurate wherever such inaccuracies suit the narrative more than would reality. They usually aren't, but they could be, and you should check before trusting them. Hell, even the author may well be a work of fiction. Most of us are. Copyright 2023 Laszlo Salieri and SRF Heavy Industries. All rights reserved. Unless otherwise noted, artwork is provided via Wombo's Dream software. Additional manipulations and logo treatments and such are copyright 2023 by Laszlo Salieri. On with the show.
For Sola, who assures me that he isn't full of bugs. Unless he ate them.
If you're not feeling infected yet, don't sweat it. Part of being a successful transmitter of pathogens is to be subtle and undetectable. Lots of biting insects, for instance, inject a bit of anesthetic to allow them to work at it longer. Here I just label all of this as fiction. It's just a story. Make believe. Just a story means harmless, right? That's what we tell the kiddies when they have a nightmare. Dreams are just stories in our heads, and stories can't hurt us. Right? Well, let me tell you about a dream I had. I was 4. I was in my big boy bed, and it was hot. I had a standing fan that blew across the bed, and I had tied my bedsheet to the bed frame's corners at the foot of the bed and tied some strings to the free corners of the bedsheet to various things around the room, a screen clip on a window, something heavy on a bookcase, so that the fan would blow into the sheet and inflate it. I have no idea why I thought this would be better than just having no sheet on top and letting the fan blow right across me. In my defense, I hadn't done a lot of studying at that point about the differences in heat dissipation capabilities of turbulent versus laminar flows. Regardless, it made a kind of noisy Ripley cave, and I slept in that, forever fiddling with it when a knot would come untied or a string would come loose or the whole thing would just collapse flat because there was too much slack somewhere. My parents got used to coming into my room in the summer to check on me now and then and finding my bed under full sail. My parents got used to a lot of things. There was an old footlocker at the bottom of my closet, mostly the blue of a pale sky for some reason despite a few decades of entropy, where I kept my toys when they weren't all over my floor. In my dream, the footlocker was always empty. The lid was propped up and, where there should have been a bottom, there were steep stairs going down into the dark red clay crawlspace under the house. I would dream that I would wake up. This has happened to me a lot over the course of my life so far, with repeating elements of plot and location and a fair bit of storyline continuity. Anyway, I would dream that I would wake up, and things would come up the ladder stairs and come out of the box, slowly push aside one of the sliding doors, and come into my room to sit on a corner of the bed. Human-shaped things with unusual numbers of arms or legs. Sometimes things with stone-scratched chitin covering their saw-toothed limbs and manted bodies, with glossy iridescences glinting whenever there was enough light, and sometimes human-sized, nearly human-shaped things that were much, much softer, that would leave damp spots on the carpet. When older siblings and cousins and such tell children about monsters, for some reason they never mention the smells. The smell of a stomped caterpillar. The smell of a cracked open beetle. The smell of the bottom of a teenager's bedroom wastebasket. The smell of a clump of dry paint in a campfire. The smell of a hot steam radiator that a dog habitually pisses on. Room-filling smells, unmistakable and unforgettable. Smells large enough that they seem like important details that someone should mention. For some reason, whatever would come up from the crawlspace would forego the sitting if the sheet sail was inflated and just stand between the closet and the bed. And this was apparently better? It was better because whatever it was would talk, and when it was sitting on the bed, I could hear it well enough to understand it. It would talk, and it would gently grab my foot and shake it now and then for emphasis in what I'm sure it must have thought was a friendly manner, and sleep paralysis would keep me from screaming, and a good time was had by all. As the dreams progressed, these things would make me climb out of bed and follow them into the closet and down the steep steps and into water-filled caverns under the house, to elsewhere. I can't recall what it used for bribery or coercion. I just remember that when the fear became too much, when I wanted to scream and wake up and couldn't, then I would switch and discover that I was it, and then I would be the one sitting on the corner of the bed, standing up, looking back at the hyperventilating boy sitting up and clutching a pillow, trying to cajole the little guy into coming along. And since that terrified little boy was me, I could just make him get up and follow despite his, or my, strenuous yet unvoiced objections. Good times. I learned a lot on my little outings. I learned the map of this new little neighborhood-adjacent bit of not very Euclidean geography. I learned the various outcrops of wooded territories and depths of loams and soils beneath them, and the heights and occupants of the various trees. I learned to peek in through windows into rooms with night lights, because night lights almost always meant rooms with sleeping children. I learned to wait for my eyes to adjust to whatever I could see from those fancy new alarm clocks with a constantly lit face and built-in radios for rooms with adults. I learned how to stand or crouch under these windows and whisper, whisper, whisper. I learned how to burrow into the mud and clay and seal myself in and wait and wait and wait. Wait for the changes. Wait for the hunger. These dreams, this continuing, self-elaborating dream, continued for years and years. Off and on, until I was 9 or 10. During this time, during the waking times, I remember the bugs. Spiders as big as your face building webs in the camellias. Monstrous thirsty mosquitoes breeding in the rain-filled cups of discarded leaves under the magnolia. Stick insects the length of my forearm. Huge green June beetles, mole crickets and Jerusalem crickets, locust-sized grasshoppers, armies of wood lice. Wasps and hornets and bumblebees and honeybees. Fireflies by the hundreds and thousands. Shield bugs. Assassin bugs. Wheel bugs. Luna moths. Ordinary centipedes, house centipedes, millipedes. The occasional tiny black scorpion. Entire civilizations of sugar ants in a hollowing willow. The pile nests of fire ants. Gigantic spongy velvet ants. Katydids and leafhoppers. Screaming cicadas, leaving their final pupal husks clamped to the pecan and mulberry and pine tree bark. I would fill my pockets with those husks, protected in little cardboard matchboxes and plastic balls from candy/toy vending machines long before there were Pokemon, and carry the little monsters to school to share with whoever was the most unwilling on any particular day. To hide in the pockets of jackets and sweaters and lunchboxes and desk cubbies, to stick to corkboards, to quietly tangle in long hair. Some kids would squeal and freak out a bit. Some would ignore them as beneath their notice. And in some I could see that mixture of revulsion and pale fascination that let me know I was not entirely alone in my dream life. I ordered a hermit crab by mail order from an ad in a comic book. I even received it and made it a little home in my room. I remember the hot roaring inside the wall next to the head of my bed, underneath the window and spreading to behind my headboard. I remember that there were always honeybees on the windowsill, and honey dripping in thin little trickles from underneath the sill, and from the plastic around the electrical socket below the window. The honey wasn't very sweet, but I would wipe it up with my fingers and eat it whenever I saw a new drip. I knew it was for me. My parents were considerably less sanguine about the discovery of the hive in my bedroom wall, and how it was supplementing my diet. They would have been even less happy had they known the kind of blooms that were supplying nectar for the honey. Rhododendrons in the neighbors' yards, mistletoe. Azaleas. but also the more harmless pear and apple blossoms, pecan and walnut and willow, magnolia and camellia, mulberry and honeysuckle and 1,000 other beautiful weeds. It made me tasty. I was constantly covered in bites from anything that drank blood. My parents moved me out of the room for a few days and had it seen to. Some external siding was removed. Insulation shifted. The queen relocated. My honey stolen. Ants ate the remnants, so occasionally I ate the ants. It was not the same. The dreams continued, however, until the last dream a year or two later, where I climbed down through the footlocker and wriggled my way into the damp clay and plugged my burrow behind me and curled up to sleep, to absorb moisture and sparse nutrients through my rubbery dissolving skin, to swell and get fat, to await the hunger and the drive to come out to climb a tree and split my skin in the moonlight and scream and scream and scream. For 17 years I would awaken my dreams to squirm in utter stifling blackness, to other dreams of skin-splitting hunger and screaming, and merely roll over and wait.
And then I woke up. Isn't that the usual happy-sappy ending for a spooky story about nightmares? It was all a dream. The end. But how can you tell if you've actually woken up when you go to sleep and wake up in your dreams too? When what people try to claim is the waking world is so ludicrous that if you had written it as fiction, it'd be passed over by publishers as too unbelievable. It can be a problem. I look around and don't see the degrees I've earned in my dreams hanging on my walls anywhere. I don't see the pets and children and cars, the companions, the extra floors above and basements below in my house. But I can sure as hell smell the damp clay. And over there in the corner is the tough crinkly cast-off shell like shiny boiled leather, thick but translucent, tidily split down the back and smelling of the chemical smell of a cockroach nest? Panic sweat? Petrichor? Best not to look too closely. If you don't look closely, it could be anything. And I am filled with the urge to climb as high as I can and scream and scream and scream. I can feel that my body is full of new organs for me to learn how to use. Spiracles. Malpighian tubules. Cormata. Antennae. A plethora of extra mouth parts. Maybe even an ovipositor. Spinnerets. An assortment of new glands and organs for brand new senses. A deliciously carapacious integument. A handful of wings and a few more legs. Eyes. So many eyes. Wonderful gifts from the Bugmother, all of them. Maybe some of these gifts are more metaphorical than actual. Unless I'm dreaming. But when am I dreaming and when am I awake? Somewhere in here there is a little boy who is too paralyzed to scream, but that little boy is me and I can make him do what I want. And what I want to do right now is climb high and scream. This right here, is my scream. Thank you for listening. So what about this infection I promised? It's a serious thing. I don't want to over-explain it though. Every time I try to explain it thoroughly, to just get it over and done, it just sounds like noise. Complicated noise filled with technical jargon hashed together from 2 or 3 different boring dry-as-dust academic disciplines. Unlikely noise. So I'll go slow, and I'll say it starts with our universal need to be connected to other people, to be accepted, to be wanted, to be needed, to be loved, and to be a part of something larger than ourselves. That's something everyone can understand, right? Because we all know that some of us that don't feel any need for any of those things, not because we're sociopathic mutants that just don't need any of those things, but because those needs, for some of us, are already met. That's what turns people into sociopaths where everyone else is concerned, that makes us not movable to pity or mercy or compassion or any of the other finer sentiments of human culture, because we are already loved and accepted and cherished and important and part of something larger than ourselves in a way that cannot possibly be threatened. That right there is what makes a sociopath. It's not that those needs are absent, but that, whatever the depths of those needs are, and I admit that individual differences can make those needs pretty damn shallow for some people, they are fully met. Often those needs are met narcissistically from within, especially in the case of our favorite childhood pet torturing budding serial killers, but the results are exactly the same when those needs are met externally. That's why churches are full of people who exhibit absolutely none of the qualities we find holy. People join, or stay, rather, since most church folks were brought in as children by family members or by someone particularly close to the family, to fulfill their own needs. To belong. They participate in services and events and projects and rituals so that they can feel like they're valuable and valued either to the hypothetical overseeing God or each other or themselves. Hopefully all three of those things. And this meets their social needs so completely that the rest of the world can literally just go to hell. Church finds an opening in people's defenses via their social needs and infects their minds, and as a huge bonus makes them communicable in a way that brings in others via evangelism, and thus becomes not just a pathology but an outbreak. Their identities and behaviors are infected with church, and it turns some of them, many of them, most of them into sick, uncaring monsters, with respect to people who don't share the infection. Even biological family members. Church overrides our evolved circuitry for attachment to family and progeny, providing clever substitutes in the form of other members and the co-opted human leadership and the invisible Godhead. In some cases church provides an assurance of irrevocable membership, unbreakable even by death, and in many instances gives a promise of forgiveness for any and every crime, removing all fear of rejection. In every version, once it's properly installed, church infection uses the human's own faculties, their conscious thought processes, problem-solving abilities, words and actions, to do church things instead of human things, a lot of times even against the human's own best interests, and church finds every single member to be disposable, replaceable, and interchangeable with respect to church's interests. Church assures you that you are treasured forever, but your value begins and ends with your ability to be used by church for church purposes. I promise you it's an infection, even though it's often not clear who or what is sick. If the infected person is in all measurable ways better off as an individual, how could they possibly be sick from it? However, if the society they are embedded in is worse off because significant numbers of the members of that society are infected, then something is sick, isn't it? That's just one example. And an easy target. Because nobody likes a cult, and cult is just what you call someone else's church infection. Until it gets well enough established to get members elected to public office anyway. And since individual church infections do not tolerate one another, they're quick to publish the worst about each other as if the same things do not apply to themselves. But let's look at another example. It's no coincidence that atrocity-committing armies have to be bands of brothers first. Every military force on Earth uses the exact same tactics, except sociopathy, the ability to treat your fellow human as prey, as a pest to be exterminated, as livestock to be stripped of or converted to resources, is the desired outcome and not a mere side effect. As long as it's directable. The trick has always been turning all that off when the soldiers come back home, preventing suicide from guilt for actions they performed while operating as army and/or defending us from the ones that brought home their strategies for dealing violently with frustration. I digress. But keep in mind that these are only two examples, two taxonomic categories, of an entire kingdom of their own. Our infection is a lot like these, to be honest. But more visceral. More picturesque. More fun. I think we need to take a little sidebar and talk about something important now. Because a lot of what I've been talking about up to now has been bestial traits. Being a sociopath, which is being prey as well as being a predator, in that it is an off switch for the empathy that could get us killed as well as preventing the delicious cruelty that comes with killing, is a valuable survival trait for any creature deeply mired in the ecological web. But we want to be above all of that. From the viewpoint of humanity, this all seems insulting and a bit backward. Except it isn't. You know in your heart it isn't. We want to be better than beasts. Or rather we want humanity to be better than beasts so we can all say I'm one of those and just coast, but that is exactly the same as the second worst form of, say, belief in one's racial supremacy. If your best brag is to say that you were born with advantages that you've never particularly exhibited and probably never used, that's weak and pathetic. But it can also be exactly the same as the worst form, which is to act like you're the top of the food chain when you're clearly not, to point to the most bestial predators and exploiters in your midst and say, "I'm one of those," and then actively try to be one of those, getting all bloody in tooth and claw and then, somehow, trying to argue that everyone but you is some kind of animal. I'm just saying it's somewhere on that spectrum that starts at abysmally stupid and ranges through sadly deluded in the middle and goes all the way up to bats hit deranged, because even a child can see how false it is. If your goal is to be badass, then your goal is to be the most animal of the animals. And if you want to be above that, and I use the word above guardedly, because it's a different value, not necessarily a higher value, then you have to understand that the urge to be a badass is just the testosterone talking, regardless of your sex and/or gender, because it's produced in the adrenal glands in those of us without testes, and testosterone is a gland thing, an animal thing, and therefore you are an animal. The other evidence that you're an animal is that you are surrounded by other animals that want to eat you or mate with you or kill you and take your stuff. Or just take your stuff if they're not feeling all that brave or badass. But these are all animal things. Things animals do to other animals. If this is the life you are embroiled in, whether or not it is voluntary on your part, odds are pretty damned good you're an animal. If you were indoctrinated with the idea since your diaper days that you are not an animal, that you were born to be better than the animals, that you must not act like an animal, but also, you must secure the safest nesting place possible for restful sleep and rearing whelps and claim the best mates possible and the territory with the best food possible and also maybe be badass enough to take any of these things from the weaker of those who are around you, all I can say is, you have to see how logically inconsistent that is. I'm trying to be kind in how I word this because some people take it poorly. Trust me when I say logically inconsistent is the kindest way I can find to say it. What mommy and daddy are trying to say when they say, "Don't act like an animal, bub," is that some animal traits are supposed to have higher moral value than others, and they want you to concentrate on and strengthen the good traits. The tough ones. They want you to develop and refine compassion, but not for enemies or people we don't like or people who could never give anything back other than gratitude, and especially not those that can't even show gratitude and deference. I.e., selective sociopathy. They want you to have curiosity, but not about sex, please, because we have to control your sexual behavior to preserve your trading/breeding value to the tribe, and also not about anything regarding the established social order that has put us on the top of the heap. They want you to be good at problem solving and the use of tools, but stay out of the damn cookie jar and gun safe and try not to burn down the house. They want you to master delayed gratification and focus on long-term goals. The cerebral hardware for that isn't really in place until you're about 25 years old, but we really need to make you vulnerable to exploitation and control by pretty promises that we may never deliver on. They want you to embrace cooperation, but don't leave yourself open to exploitation by anyone but our short list of approved exploiters. They want you to be capable of trust, ditto. They want you to cultivate faith, even more ditto. They want you to respect your elders/betters/those who have established themselves as successful, i.e., the set of people that contains the exploiters, but you can't try to filter those out without facing brutal punishment. They want you to master settling disputes and disagreements with nonviolent displays and compromises, except for members of the cult of badass, who are in turn typically exploited as a group by the wealthy or powerful, so they are subtly encouraged to act out as long as they don't bite the wrong people. And they want you to be irrationally enthusiastic about supporting and defending your family, or, apparently, predatory/parasitical entities that exploit you by trying to get you, my brothers/sisters/children/podmates/broodmates/teammates and/or fellow hatchlings of the Bugmother, to think of their members as your family, at all costs, even to the point of self-sacrifice, but certainly to the point of putting aside your needs and goals for theirs, for no reward other than their approval and, of course, the continued survival of those you are told to love who do not necessarily have any of your interests at heart. All of these are animal traits. You can find them in bees and ants and baboons and octopuses and crows and dogs and rats. Even the inconsistencies, even the vulnerabilities to being exploited. Not a single one of them is unique to humanity. These are all animal things. We watch teeny little videos of animals doing these things, specifically because they are doing these things, which is why we find them adorable, for hours every day on our phones. But we can't address these traits, assess their values and weaknesses, if we treat them as holy and flawless and the things that somehow make us above the animals. Admit you have the problem, and then you can work on the problem, they say. Denial is just going to keep you from starting. Here I am being deceptive. I'm talking like I've just climbed out of the ground, new and confused about what shape I'm going to take, trying to pump fluid into my limbs and appendages to bulk myself up before my carapace hardens. But that was all decades ago. It was the first metamorphosis of many. When your first metamorphosis strikes, I hope you don't do what many of us do. We trundle off to the Gregor Samsa Memorial Well, draw up a big bucketful, and take a good long drink of boohoo. What will the neighbors think? I'll just lock myself in my room and wait to die. The infection wouldn't take root in you if it didn't have a use for you. You didn't have a use for it. The Bugmother's process isn't what anyone sane would call infallible, but if it's anything, it's useful. And it's tailored to suit you. Maybe the storyline of your dreams, the one you most desire, is precisely the Samsa-esque tragic farce that cuts your tedium short and leaves your discarded carcass in the landfill, giving you the excuse you needed to look back from your non-existent afterlife and say, "That is why I never achieved anything of note. I was cursed." That sounds like an excellent excuse for your mediocrity, except you never needed one and nobody cares and there's no one to listen to you yell about it. But also, mediocrity is a fucking art form. Mediocrity is a wonder. On a bizarre little mudball like the planet we share, if you can get to mediocrity from wherever you started, just remember that there are billions of people here that would treasure the bland guarantee of continued day-to-day survival while also remaining utterly beneath the notice of anyone with power or authority or a life philosophy based on jealousy or greed or lust or control. Why would you want to shit on mediocrity? That urge to put a mass-produced bumper sticker on your used Prius and point to it and exclaim, "See? That proves I'm not ordinary," is reprehensibly ordinary. It's the be original, drink Dr. Pepper, of ordinary. It's succumbing to someone else's marketing plan to get you to distinguish yourself just enough for you to be a capital D demographic target for marketing manipulation and vote badgering and wealth extraction. Resist that. Because from the heart of mediocrity you can do anything anonymously, at any time. You might only get one shot. Or you might be able to retreat back to your mediocre shield and strike again and again and again and keep getting away with it, right up to your next metamorphosis. I'm saying this because among the Bugmother's most popular gifts, among the most powerful and most treasured, are mimicry and camouflage. The gift comes in 3 forms. 1. To look like something you're not, to look dangerous or disgusting or distasteful so predators and bullies leave you alone. 2. To look like your surroundings so you can hide and go about your business, either avoiding predators or stalking victims, your choice. Or 3. To look and smell and sound like your prey so you can move among them and help yourself to the best of what they have to offer. Of what they hoard and save for themselves. With the relevant gift, none of the animal traits I was ranting about earlier are actually traits. By that I mean they're not built-in characteristics of the animals that we are, but instead are attitudes and behaviors that we can take off and put on and sculpt and adapt to give us better access to what would otherwise be defended and impenetrable territory. And we can armor all of the weaknesses too, every last one of them, as we see fit. And now you can see how complicated it can be to handle just one of the Bugmother's gifts. This is why there's screaming when it gets dropped in your lap. The sudden awareness that things aren't like what you thought they were, despite what you were told all of your life, that supposed certainties are truly uncertain, the sudden realization that you aren't the kind of creature you thought you were. That freaky split-open shell over in the corner is about 90% shattered illusions. Even after you climb out of it, it's still best to not look at it too closely.
People are pretty free with what they choose to designate as a bug, and that is fine by me. There's a taxonomic designation of a true bug, the Hemiptera order of class Insecta, or sometimes just the suborder Heteroptera of the order Hemiptera, depending on who's arguing, and I guess it's true that those are pretty much the true epitome of bugs. 6 legs, exoskeletons keeping their various juices in, antennas, weird little buggy eyes, hard shell wing cases, membranous wings kept underneath those, sucking mouth parts. Yap, all true bugs suck. They fly, but they don't seem to be great at it. Not graceful. My favorite of the true bugs is some Jurassic-sized steampunk throwback called a wheel bug. It's related to assassin bugs. It is a predator. It has what looks like a huge-ass cog embedded in its back and a long stabby proboscis that it will try to put all the way through the palm of your hand if you try to pick it up without due respect. They get huge where I spent the bulk of my younger days. To some people, any arthropod is a bug. Even crabs and shrimp and whatever the hell those fan-waving things are that live in corals and spiders and scorpions and centipedes and millipedes and woodlice, you know, those land isopod crustacean thingies. Pill bugs. Roly-polies, and even many worms. Bug is the tidy one-syllable signifier for the ancient concept of everything that creepeth upon the earth, and under it that at one time just meant animals excepting humans or birds or fish, that later was popularly refined to mean all the things with no legs or far too many, with no eyes or far too many. Which is a bit of a semantic drift from things that creep to just creepy things, but whatever. I'm on board. Even people can be bugs, performatively I guess, if they act creepy. As in, stop bugging me. Jesus. Bugging, in this case, means being present, but with a poor grasp of personal space and or the subtle rules governing eye contact and or repeated attempts at conversation and or requests for attention or otherwise just simple motions or postures that disturb the rest or contemplation or concentration or personal sense of calm, harmony, or peace of another individual. Which is kind of mean, since most bugs themselves prefer to be out of the way and remain unnoticed. It's certainly not their fault that you glow charmingly in the infrared spectrum, promising them some warmth to help them get moving, that you sprayed yourself all over with floral essences that tell them you were hiding a vat of tasty nectar somewhere in one of your crevices, or that you parked your carcass right where their surveyors were planning a major thoroughfare, or that your capillaries just happened to be full of their next meal and the best place to host the next stage of life of the plasmodium they're carrying. Even a bug can be a victim of someone else's agenda. Anyone can be a bug. It's a very inclusive group. When you're bugging someone successfully, you can develop a certain sharp and acrid smell, like hot plastic just before it melts or burns. This is a tiny olfactory complement to the droning whine of your tiny, blurry membranous wings when you are hovering around someone. Also, you may find that you are starting to be drawn to brighter people. And you can develop disabilities regarding how to get through open doors and windows when people want you to leave. With other methods of bugging people, especially ones where you find you're merely sitting too close to someone, you may find yourself exuding an oleaginous slime that is meant to help you squeeze through porous soil and into the company of the unwilling. You may notice that you are leaving a damp or dark spot on fabric-covered furniture, however, but don't be alarmed or ashamed. This is just your nature. If you're on a subway or a bus, just look around at the seats that have just been vacated by others. You'll find that you're not exactly on your own out there. Because as a bug, you are never alone. It turns out that more of us are bugs than most people are prepared to contemplate. There are those of us who are just quiet and content to hang out in a corner and observe. A treasured few of us are tolerated in typical human company because we are expected to help handle other bugs if and when they show up, to catch them and drag them off to the side and interact with them on standard bug levels so that no one has to feel particularly awkward or hostile, either from the viewpoint of bugs who don't know how to read the nuances of human facial expressions or body language or the indirect coded politenesses of spoken subtext, or from the viewpoint of the people who don't know how to respond to the chirps or chemical emissions or intricate dances or elaborate constructions or brightly colored displays we use when communicating with one another. Most people think of bugs as social or antisocial creatures and look down on them for being a chore to tolerate or include in human social activities. Most people prefer to actively exclude bugs for their own comfort, and, at least in theory, for the comfort of the bugs as well. But bugs are intensely social. Even if some are observed to be solitary, they form relationships with others of their kind, of any kind, really, through the records of their passage that are distributed throughout their environment. Like books and the internet. In this way, those relationships can transcend ordinary time and space. But the social needs of most bugs are more immediate. They are perfectly fine doing buggy things in one another's company, but also they are interested in interacting with and learning from humanity as well. Why would they not be? Humanity is fascinating. Humans communicate internally with themselves via a suite of autonomic reactions they call emotions and spend endless hours running analyses on these reactions to try to determine how and why they occurred and what they actually mean, and so decipher, sometimes long after the fact, why they acted or reacted in a particular way. Otherwise, they find themselves carted around involuntarily on waves of these emotions, frequently finding that their actions and reactions are a complete mystery, or at least an illogical mess, and try to cope with the fallout as best they can. Humans are simply, in themselves, plural. Their logical/rational selves spend most of their time trying to trick or cajole or manipulate their emotional selves into not sabotaging any of the strategies they must enact for long-term survival in human cultures. This is no shock, seeing as human cultures have been thoroughly colonized by various entities made almost entirely of language, some far more benign than others, that maintain control of natural resources like air and water and food and medicine and shelter and demand that humans consistently perform a suite of certain largely incomprehensible actions in order to obtain and maintain access to these critical resources. By extension, it's kind of easy to see that the logical/rational selves that inhabit every human are effectively part of that colonizing force, if not directly part of it, then frequently so entirely dominated by it that it is impossible to distinguish the verbal, linguistic part of the creature from the infection. In light of this insight, it's easy to see that the hours spent in analysis of the emotional part of humanity are, one cella, part of the ongoing struggle of the logical, language-based portion of humanity to tame that more animal/emotional part. On another cella, one can see that, without appropriate defenses, success at this analysis will leave the composite human more vulnerable to domination from these language-based infections. It's hard to know whether to root for them to come to understand themselves or for them to continue to fail so that they will remain safer. Either way, many bugs are extremely fond of humanity and its messiness, particularly because of how they expand the reach of our habitats and leave plenty of dark corners and debris to process for our own needs. The more buggy we are, the more we ourselves are immune to the kind of domination that plagues and/or causes human civilization. To their infection, our desires seem more esoteric, making us harder to manipulate. We aren't as interested in hoarding critical resources. The things we collect are usually chosen for other qualities. Our communications with each other operate on many simultaneous bands, most of which are grounded in solid facts, so many lies or manipulations delivered by language alone tend to stand out. Sometimes we communicate solely in our own private languages just for the sake of safety and security, but also for amusement and to keep our minds sharp. Becoming more buggy is a direct response to the infection that separates the bulk of humanity from their fair share of what our Earth has to offer them. A survival response. While we still interact with humanity when we can, we remain more free to form our own support networks based on the natural, unspoofable interactions of the ecological web. Until, of course, we attract the notice of their infection and it gears up to attempt to either assimilate or eradicate us. Their infection requires a human monoculture that will support it in order to remain dominant, but the only possible end for a monoculture is collapse. That collapse is usually brought about by an unstoppable disease or infection, which is already in place, or a radical change to the climate, which is already guaranteed, because monocultures lack the diversity to adapt to new situations. So either strategy, assimilation or eradication, will be impossible in the long run due to nothing more than our diversity, which also leads to an increased rate of mutation and speciation, which means even more immunity, etc. In these terms, the bugginess mutation is a counter-infection, because it is also transmissible, but one that should be encouraged under the circumstances, for the sake of humanity's survival. or the survival of some form of humanity, in any case.
Some of us connoisseurs of horror find comfort in how large the universe seems to be, and how all of the scary things we see and read about tend to be focused on humanity. Humanity is a whopping 0.1% of all of the living biomass on Earth. Given how we have numerous types of environments on Earth that are chock full of life where a human wouldn't last 10 seconds, it's reasonable to think that there would be life at one time or another, however briefly, on 1 out of every 100 planets, if not closer to 1 in 10, so even if human life or Earth life could never survive there, and maybe right at this very instant on 1 in 1,000, or 1 in 10,000 if you're more of a pessimist or picky about where you draw the line. Between living and non-living, it is a bit of a spectrum, I admit. That's not taking into account any of the potential forms of life that wouldn't even need a planet. As long as you have an energy gradient, a source of heat or light or motion in an otherwise empty arena, at whatever scale, cascading through a bunch of different materials with different properties in a fluid, in the sense of being able to move and flow and mix, but more or less stable environment that dissipates that energy, and some chaos. Note that that word isn't capitalized or in italics or anything, so I'm referring to the absolutely mundane ubiquitous mathematical and physical principle that uses that name. You will get a system on the living spectrum almost immediately. It will come and go a million times in a million different ways until the kinds that can last are the ones that do last. And then you have life. It really is that simple. Stars aren't the only sources of energy for energy gradients out there, but they absolutely count, and they're easy to count, and almost every single one of them comes with planets and moons and such. And since there are a couple 100 sextillion of those that we know about, mathematically I have to decide that our teeny crop of humans here just isn't all that important. On a universal scale. And neither would be any monster or devil that preys on them exclusively. Hell, humans are hardly the most important life form here on Earth. We've shown ourselves to be capable of being annoying grit in the gears of our planetary ecology, but that doesn't make us important. Oxygen-farting algae wrecked the place first for all of their now long-dead anoxic colleagues, some of whose descendants still have healthy colonies here and there. Trees, ordinary you can see 'em everywhere trees, wrecked the place for real, and the aftermath of that is still going on, because we keep digging up their carboniferous corpses and burning them. Humanity's impact will sting, sure, but only for about 10 million years. Maybe 20. Hardly a blip. Global human culture will be one of our own casualties. And then whoever is left of us will have to stick around to see how crows wreck the place when they discover fire. And decide that all of our shallowly buried plastic is the best fuel. What I'm saying is that any existential threat, any horror, that focuses on humanity can only ever be as important as humanity. And on a universal scale, on a cosmic scale, humans don't even register. If something is going to be a cosmic horror, then it's going to have to be bigger than something that plagues one tiny species of megafauna on one tiny little mudball orbiting one tiny little star in one teeny galaxy of hundreds of billions. The threat is going to need to be literally universal. Like something that affects the very math that allows life to develop. Like a governing principle that promises greater and greater levels of derangement and insanity to every form of life that progresses beyond some minimum level of self-awareness. Like a congeries of universal principles that promises to eradicate that derangement, or promises to add to it in an ever-accelerating fashion until the lifeform in question self-destructs. Like a principle of life that targets and infects the typical derangements that pester organisms like, but not necessarily limited to, humanity. Because then you don't know whether you should resist the infection or root for it, but you're going to have to choose one or the other. I'm kind of liking the infection at the moment. It's a little unfair of me to talk about humanity as if there's only one kind, as if all of humanity is a deranged and poisonous threat to the rest of the planet, but only a little. For the record, the only part of humanity that's a problem is the part that knows that it is separate from and superior to the rest of, well, everything. As a random example, even Buddhism, which is typically kindly disposed toward other forms of life, places humanity above the rest, as if incarnating as a human is a required step on the path to godhood. As if godhood can only be derived from superior and refined forms of humanity. As if the best thing that can happen to you once you have managed to be the best human possible is oblivion, which the more cynical among us see as a fitting end for that kind of human for an entirely different set of reasons. It's a lovely prank to trick them into heading into oblivion under their own power. It's like telling mice that there's an awesome party going on down the throat of that snake, and you can tell it's the coolest party ever because no mouse that goes down there ever chooses to come back out. Anyway, all of the most popular religions on earth tell humans that everything on earth other than themselves is to be referred to as it, as something with no rights, to be eaten or exploited or destroyed with no consequence. Sometimes there is a mumbled afterword about responsible stewardship, but it's usually drowned out by the shouts of glee and struggles over ownership and destruction of resources just for the sake of ensuring scarcity, and therefore the social dominance of those lucky enough to have scraped together modest hoards. But even the idea of stewardship implies a level of exaltation that isn't backed up by the basic and brutal math of ecology. I'm not blaming religion solely for this derangement. It's pretty obvious that the majority portion of humanity that doesn't give a damn about verses or sutras or pasukim or suras or whatever the local language calls a verse of scripture is still convinced of its own unsurpassable elevation and its right to dominate and exploit and destroy anything not human, and is often quick to redefine a number of populations of humans as not quite human enough to avoid the same fate, as if we, at our core, had no need at all for any of the rest of the crap here on Earth that, all together, in one huge dynamic aggregate, keeps our human asses alive. Itness is built into most of our dominant languages, and that determines not only how we think about non-humanity, but how we must think about non-humanity. How we can think. And if even one culture thinks in terms of hoarding, all of the rest of them have to do it too to defend themselves. If you're bright, you can see the further problems inherent in language there, that there are objects that can be thought of as if they were separate from their contexts, that there are contexts that can be thought of separately from hypothetical objects embedded in them, that you are somehow a different object or entity with respect to me, and that either or both of us can have properties or contexts that we control or own or have dominion over separate from each other and or are theoretically separate contexts. These things are built into the languages we use, but they are counter to, say, scientific observation. Except we publish all of our scientific findings in these same languages that firmly distinguish subjects of study from everything else while mathematically trying their best to relate the dependencies of those subjects on anything and everything else, one supposedly separate phenomenon at a time. What can I say? It's trying, it's better than nothing, and in every single way it's better than not trying. Our infection counters those linguistic problems a bit. It gets behind and underneath the language where it can. It helps us reconnect with our buggy roots, as it were. It helps us keep in mind that the smallest indivisible unit of life is an ecology, that the smallest individual unit of humanity is an ecology, that the smallest indivisible unit of a mind is an ecology, the smallest individual unit of a thought, of a concept, even, is an ecology. And an ecology can in no way ever be separate from the cosmos that hosts it. It's possible that two ecologies can be separate from each other if they operate outside of one another's regions of causality, but they would both still have roots in the same cosmos, and therefore still have kinship due to sharing the same guiding principles. In theory. But what I'm saying here is that any arbitrary division between forms of life can only be valid if it's also largely irrelevant. What I'm saying is that thinking of any part of existence in terms of indivisible units is where the art and science of thinking itself gets off track. Let me tell you, that is a huge source of horror for a bunch of people. Imagine that there's someone who has been told that their problem is impurity, that they have to make themselves pure and keep themselves pure in order to become and remain acceptable to their God and their family and their community. I will tell you now that there are countless people like this, because that's what racism and nationalism and religious bigotry means, but there are a lot of imaginary strictures about contaminants that seem less extreme than those. Imagine explaining to this person that it is physically and mathematically impossible for them to ever be completely separate from, that they will forever be to one extent or another contaminated by, everything they are told that they have to hate and avoid. Imagine something finally opening their eyes to the fact that the same swirling chaos of flows of particles and forces and waveforms that makes a pig, in this arbitrary example, is also what makes them, as a biological human. Imagine them finally understanding that they wouldn't even exist without all of the forces and conditions being in place that requires pigs to exist also. Imagine them discovering that it's only a matter of meaningless, arbitrary perspectives that both they and pigs are nearly identical flows of energy and resources with identical inputs and identical outputs, that their similarities are billions of times more numerous than their quite temporary differences, and there's no determining factor other than random chance that they seem to be one and not the other. Imagine how delicious that shock must be. And in order to hate something or fear something, they must, of course, maintain an idealized copy of, a simulacrum of, the hated thing at its worst in their own mind so they can remember that they need to react badly to it. So that they can rehearse their reactions and make sure they'll get them right when the time comes. Every inoculation is a contamination, even if it's only psychological. Usually it takes some kind of drug to achieve epiphanies like these, which is exactly why those drugs are frequently banned by those religions and cultures that would be the most adversely impacted by such revelations. Sometimes all it takes is a simple dream or daydream or vision. In any case, the reason a drug or a dream can reveal these conclusions to us is that these conclusions are already in our brains waiting for us to notice them and understand them and integrate them, conclusions we can, and eventually must, draw about the world around us from the information gathered by merely being awake and aware. I'm not a big fan of the concept of gnosis, which is the Greek-derived term modern people use for just knowing something without actually bothering to study and check sources and analyze and test it. Another word for it would be imagination, or possibly delusion. But as much as I hate it, there are some things we just know, that the chemistry of our bodies has done all the work to know on our behalf. And if we don't like the source of that knowledge, we can analyze and test the hell out of it, and out of an abundance of caution I recommend doing exactly that, to make sure that what we've come to realize is accurate. Because our gut feelings and instincts are biased toward comfort and survival rather than truth and accuracy and fact, and we all know that sometimes what keeps us alive and content is a comforting lie and a millions of years long lucky streak. At the very bottom of everything, your twitching, hungry, thirsty, horny corpus knows that everything that has ever grown on this filth and scum-covered mudball comes from the same clay, that the air-filled gap between us and anything and everything else is temporary and largely illusory, because invisible as it is, the air itself is a dense fluid medium that connects every object we think of as solid and separate, including ourselves, and it is full of the exact same messenger molecules that flow in the fluids of our own bodies that tell us how to grow and change and react and die. Microscopic creatures and viruses and pheromones and fragments of code and chemical dusts and ions, dead fragments and living creatures and everything in between, are constantly exhaled and sweated and oozed and pissed and shat by 600 gigatons of our living neighbors on top of the kilometers-high stacks of the same output from billions of years of our dead ancestry, much more than a mere 500 million years thanks to the reservoirs of our oceans, which remember everything, and that isn't even taking into account the billions of years of meteoric infall of similar dusty influence from the universe at large or the continuous massage of incoming electromagnetic radiation and gravitic jostling from the rest of the invisible cosmos. Our physiologies are wide open to these manipulations because these methods are how our nuclei, our cells, our tissues, our organs, our bodies, our family members and tribe members talk to one another about the state of the world and give advice on how to handle anything that happens. Our little immune systems do what they can regarding the truly life-threatening messages. But the rest of it? The doors are wide open. They always have been, and they have to be. And that's just the physical and chemical and biochemical languages that web us all together. If you've actually bothered to learn spoken or written or gestured languages, and have eyes and ears and hands for the more aesthetic languages of the arts and music, our acceptance and interpretation of which is also influenced by our raw chemistry and lifelong experiences of our global and local environments, then you have trepanned the holes in your own skull that allow all of the rest of the world lightning-fast access to those deepest depths of your brain that would otherwise be locked away and defended by bone and chemistry. Those depths that I am poking with these words right now. Imagine what else is already in your brain, lurking in a dark corner of that crawlspace you have yet to visit, waiting for the light from your flashlight. Because your infection is already in there, buried in the clay of your mind, absorbing everything it needs, swelling, twitching, waiting until the time is right to emerge and drag you into that crawlspace by your horrified childlike hand to show you what else you've been missing.
A centipede lives under my pillow and whispers to me while I sleep. She's young. She tells me that she has laid dozens of eggs nearby, in the frame of the bed, I think, and she's waiting for them to hatch. She's worried about how her 50 or 60 children will be treated. The Scolopendra family tends to be treated poorly here, she says, and humans are quick to kill them or run them off at every chance. She says that one of her family was accused of murdering a 7-year-old girl who fell ill immediately after being bitten and died within 30 hours. She says they are kind and would never hurt anyone. She says that they gather fruit for human young and leave it in their little nests. She has bitten me twice. On the same arm. My shoulders are broad. When I sleep on my side, my pillow is not thick enough to support my head, so I put my arm under my pillow. She says she woke up badly, both times, and that she's sorry. Her bites are nearly unendurable for the first hour or two, then they are merely painful and tender for days. And then they itch for weeks as the necrotic tissue sloughs off and is slowly replaced. Also, I don't believe that she or anyone else in her extended tribe know what the hell human babies eat. And though they can get up to a handspan in length, I'm sure wrangling fruit is beyond them. Unless it's just a translation problem and she's just talking about whatever it is they themselves eat. So I guess I could maybe see them leaving dead spiders in cribs. But I can't imagine human parents being grateful. Our relationship is tenuous and fraught. She believes I'm her dear friend. I can't afford to show her any ill will because I don't think I'm fast enough to kill her. There's nowhere else I can go. She can get to me at any time while I sleep, and I have to sleep. She would bite me anywhere, every night, if she knew how I felt about her. It's best if I encourage her to think we're on the best of terms. Domestic bliss. She whispers only about things in the house, so I don't think she grew up in the forest nearby. I think she hatched and was reared here, inside. She whispers of birds as if they were disembodied voices and not as voracious scrabblers dining on her kin. But there are geckos in the house, and I must count on them to see to her children. I have lived here for years and I've never seen 60 centipedes in the house at once, even tiny ones, so I must assume that the geckos took care of most of her brothers and sisters. She talks of the geckos disdainfully, of their nighttime screaming and squawking, of their territorial displays and vicious fights, of them stalking and eating their own hatchlings, of how they scream when their parents swallow them whole. She has a point. The geckos are barbarians. Not very family-oriented. I never talk to her more than a sentence or two at a time, but she whispers on and on about my dreams as if I relate them to her while they're happening. In the hypnagogic times, as I'm drifting off, she tells me about her day and her stories show up in my dreams, hiding in the dark and proudly and expertly pouncing on anything that wanders too close to her or her eggs, listening to the walls and wooden parts of the bed by touch to know when there are ants or spiders or blood-drunk mosquitoes, filled with my own blood, no doubt, and her absolute favorite, or ticks, a close second under the circumstances since there aren't any bedbugs, or angry. Snide exchanges with the jumping spiders, or sightings of the huntsman. An enormous spider, she says, is roughly the size of my face, far too large for her to eat, almost certainly large enough to eat her. She whispers of it with a certain amount of reverence. When it appears in my dreams, it's usually sitting in a corner with a few pages of an open newspaper, looking out over the top of reading glasses. It's a fatherly image for sure. I don't know if it's silently judging, trying to decide if and when it might be appropriate to blurt a criticism or grudgingly dole out some approval, or if, like dads everywhere, it just wants a bit of quiet to think about the world and whatever mistakes it made to land it where it is now. In my waking hours, I see huntsman spiders this large in my house now and then. Like when I lived at home with my own father, we give each other plenty of room. I have never seen one read. I have no alarm, so there is another gentle slog through hypnagogia when I wake. This is when she whispers to me about the relatives I have seen in my dreams, of my wanderings in the underground city I habitually visit, of its university where I work and study and conduct my research, of the cavernous parklands and the bay to which they are adjacent, of the hours and hours I spend in my dreams making devices, programming and instructing these devices, and writing. Writing exams, writing stories, writing papers and articles and pamphlets and manuals and monographs on topics I've never studied. She whispers of the searches I've made to recover things I've never had and never lost, of friends living and dead that I haven't seen for years, of friends that exist only in these dreams that blend and fade into each other and into everyone else I've known. I catch her smirking at my lengthy searches for restrooms or privacy of any kind. A recurring annoyance in dream life. She approves of the writing. Beatifically, as if it's a gift she has personally given me. She says, when her eggs hatch, that she will cuddle her hatchlings until their first molt and tell them all of the stories from my dreams over and over, feeding them my new dreams in tiny pieces as I dream them, and raise them all to be writers themselves. She says she will send them out to collect knowledge of the world and various story elements to assemble and encourage them, one at a time, to whisper their stories to me as I sleep so I can write them and submit them for publication. She says I will judge their stories and give them critiques and help them be better writers. I can tell that she treasures the possibility of a multi-volume anthology of their collected works someday. She says she'll win awards and prizes from the Bugmother for raising her children so well, for ensuring that they are equipped for prestigious careers in the respected fields of academia and the arts. I do my best to inform her that careers in academia and the arts are only respected in my dreams. She replies, simply, "Where do you think we are?" She goes on, "Where do you think I've hidden my eggs? Where do you think I'll cuddle them when they hatch?" I no longer believe she laid her eggs in the bed frame. Nor do I believe that I can count on the geckos to be of much assistance. "Count them," I request. 72, she replies. "Well, that's only half a gross." She talks naively of their future. Of how I will name them all. Of the one that will collect and restore old bicycles. Of the one that will study medicine and move throughout my body, looking for errors to edit and improvements to make. Of the pair that will do everything together, like twins, and invent new games. Each one will choose a subject in which to excel, she declares. They will be like muses. Like muses in reverse. It'll be up to me to feed each of them with everything I'm going to forget. I will be their muse. I tell her of my worries, that they will eat me when I can no longer keep them fed, that they'll have children of their own, and then there will be so many that they'll eat each other. I have to make sure I put it in terms of worrying about her children and grandchildren. She considers me their surrogate father and will be angry if it seems I'm less inclined to self-sacrifice than she thinks is appropriate for the role in which she's cast me. She laughs. She says it's a mark of her excellent good judgment that she's found someone to help her raise them who so obviously wants to hold them and love them forever and ever, but she says I must find a way to deal with the sadness of letting each of them go, so that they all can find new dreams in which to hunt, new homes where they can make their own nests. She says I must give them away, one at a time, when they are ready, with an appropriate story for each. That is the point of publishing their stories. But she begs me not to fret, because she is young and strong and has many more years in which to give me an annual clutch of her eggs.
That's the end. The show's over. Go home.